Welcome to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, July 7th, 2020. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We're shooting for a different kind of enlightenment here. We kind of break the rules for Native radio. We don't do prayers, we don't do buffalo speeches, and we don't do spirituality shows. We take a tough look at history, oppression, survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity, and we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us, and we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. Hey, if you're watching us, you are watching us either on Facebook Live, or you are watching us on our YouTube channel, or perhaps you're listening to us on our podcast. So by all means, subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV, or subscribe to our podcast, which you can find on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Just look for Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast. Look, I'm going to talk about all the appeals that we try to make over morality, over honor, over respect, oftentimes just fall flat, because in the world that we live in, or that surrounds us, especially in the United States, in the capitalist society that we live in, money talks. And I'm kind of specifically talking about the mascot issue, but I'm going to expand that thought beyond just the mascot issue. Look, there has been a solid effort for 30 years, actually more than that, but a solid effort for 30 years to try to get the Washington football team, the U.S. Capitol, the billion-dollar franchise from the U.S. Capitol, to change its name from the racial slur that it is to something that does not misappropriate Native imagery, that does not make a mockery of who we are, that is not based on a racial slur. That effort's been there, and we have enlisted the help of psychologists and all kinds of people who've done analyses. The United States has been party to international commissions to end all forms of racism and discrimination, and yet there in the U.S. nation's capital, they have a sports franchise, a billion-dollar sports franchise with a racial slur for a name. We've tried to shame people. We've tried to appeal to decency and morality, and it's always fallen flat. There was an effort to challenge the right to trademark a racial slur, and that was pretty successful until a group of who was being precluded or prevented from using a racial slur as the name of their band, an Asian band using a racial slur for Asians, it kind of disrupted the whole argument. Previously, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office said, no, we will not provide U.S. government and court protection for a racial slur or for any kind of derogatory speech. Free to use it, but we're not going to give you trademark protection. We're not going to protect your moneyed interest in a racial slur. Well, that changed when this group decided to call themselves the Slants, and they challenged their right to trademark that name. So the Washington football team lost those trademark arguments, always lost those trademark, because they were using a racial slur that they weren't a part of the affected group. They were just the ones who had appropriated this racial slur, and they lost every time. And it wasn't until somebody else had a similar argument that the Supreme Court basically made the use of the R word a moot in terms of challenging it on a trademark. But see, that argument and the effectiveness of that argument would have created a financial burden. The NFL never would approve of a team having a name that they couldn't copyright protect. They couldn't prevent, counterfeit, Washington jerseys and all that other stuff. If they couldn't have the official seal and have that protected through the Patent and Trademark Office, they never would have allowed it. So the financial interest would have challenged that, but of course that became a moot point. So now And in the midst of Black Lives Matter protests because of the murder of George Floyd and so many other black people and other people of color, for that matter, that have been murdered by the police or murdered in general and covered up by the police. Because of that movement and the racial tensions associated with it, combine that with even the Confederate statues issue. So you had this convergence of issues between a real live murder, caught on film, and this idea of this Jim Crow era, we're going to put it in your face with Confederate statues, finally running its course. I mean, all of this came together to now raise issues even more thoroughly about racial slurs, promotion of racism. You had the butter company, Land O'Lakes, take the native woman off, and although they were doing it for other reasons, not anything to do with right or wrong, but Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, these products no longer wanted to be in the business of promoting these racial stereotypes, and of course, again, the key word there is business. They were afraid that there was going to be a financial cost to continue to plow that road. Major investors, across the globe for that matter, insisted upon the Washington football team that they needed to change their name, including FedEx, which is the sponsor of their stadium, Nike, Pepsi. In fact, Walmart and Target pulled all of the Washington merchandise off of their shelves. No longer available. So Nike no longer produces or sells Washington merchandise, and these retailers, the two biggest retailers in the United States, Target and Walmart, said, "No, we're pulling it off the shelves." That's the only thing that's changed. The morality question, and in fact, even the investors, even the moneyed interest that drove this home to Washington, were doing it because of money. They're doing it because of the financial fallout. I'd like to say that there was some level of enlightenment, and that somebody became woke, as they say. They didn't. This wasn't about woke. This is about being broke. This is a completely different incentive. Now, I'm not complaining. I'm not complaining that that it's being pulled for the wrong reason. And now, I understand the reason, and I understand exactly what drives. I mean, that's why I supported the trademark argument. Beyond whether I think it's the propriety of the federal government in terms of what they protect. Look, there's all kinds of unethical things that the U.S. government protects with their courts, with their trademark protection, with the regulatory issues and all that stuff. And we'll even talk about that a little bit. But in this case, what we saw was all of those arguments about right and wrong, all of the negative impact, all of the the stereotype and racism, all that stuff didn't change anything. At least not regarding the NFL franchise in the U.S. nation's capital. No, didn't affect anything there. Only when big money talked to big money, then all of a sudden it had an effect. Now, I will say, as Native people, we were winning the war on high schools and even colleges. We were winning that battle. We were, every year, high schools that not only had the racial slur, the R word for the name, but other ones that had Native mascots or nicknames, warriors, braves, Indians, all of it. As I'm wearing my Caucasian shirt, by the way. No, we were winning that. Every year, these schools were dropping these names. They're dropping like flies, as they say. I was a part of a local one here in a suburb of Buffalo, Lancaster High School, and they were the R word. And I was a part of not protesting. I didn't look. I never went to Lancaster to raise hell. I was invited in by the superintendent and the school board so they could hear directly from Native people. And I was among a group of us that were asked to go and explain what's wrong with this idea and why aren't we honored? Why don't we feel honored and all that stuff? So I was invited in. Now I've also weighed in uninvited to many other debates in various schools. You know, folks in the Neshaminy, down in Wilmington, Delaware. I mean, different places. In fact, I went to a couple of school board meetings and in various places to offer the insight that I can offer as a Native person and as somebody who can contextualize the issue and somebody who can communicate what the issues are. I went to a school myself that was called is called the Cambridge Indians. And look, even going to a class reunion a couple of years ago, I raised the issue then. Now, I haven't gone and campaigned at that school. I'm not saying that I won't. But I grew up in that. I was for much of the time that I was in high school, I was the only native family. My family was the only Native family there. And so I knew what that felt like. And yeah, on some levels, there was a certain respect for being Native that was there. But look, I still recall being, called, being referred to in ways that seemed okay because they were my buddies, right? Calling a red N-word, a prairie N-word. I mean, these kind of expressions have been used for many, many years. And when it comes from your friend, it's like, I guess it's like calling your buddy a bitch or something like that. But I can't remember ever being called that, a bitch. But I remember the derogatory, even when they were used as some sort of, backhanded, term of endearment or whatever. I don't know. But I still recall them. And it's funny, somebody just recently posted, as we were talking about these mascots, and let's not forget songs like One Little, Two Little, Three Little India, or John Brown Had a Little Indian, all that stuff that as kids, I remember being taunted on the playground in 4th grade and grabbing the back of one of my classmates, it was this girl, grabbing the back of her dress. You know how they got like a ribbon that ties behind, and I grabbed it and it ripped it right off of her dress. Man, did I catch hell. There was no hell caught for, somebody running around singing, One Little, Two Little, Three Little Indians, because that was acceptable. Ripping a girl's dress, that was never appropriate. But these are the kind of, and I wasn't like insane out of my mind, crazy mad, but it annoyed me enough that I chased her and I grabbed her and ripped her dress. But I mean, I still can remember these things. In fact, I could name the girl. I mean, I remember it as clear as could be. So, But in going to these schools, I could relay, the experience. I could talk not only about perhaps the less offensive misnomers like Indians, and of course every school that uses a Native mascot fails to recognize the Native people of the area, that the indigenous people to that area. They always put the Plains Indian headdress, right? They always have the same kind of imagery. And so if I went where I went to school, it would have been Mohawks, Gunyagahaga that would have been in that area. Now they're never represented on the logos, and I'm not saying that would have solved the problem, but it just kind of shows that by stereotyping us, you miscommunicate what a Native person is. I mean, most people don't even see us and recognize us as Native people today because it's ingrained in their heads through cartoons, through Hollywood, through media, through advertisement, through, everything. What a Native person is, what it looks like. I mean, I don't think there's any Native person who hasn't, and I don't care how dark they are, I don't care how long their hair is, or unless they're dancing in regalia, I think almost every Native person at some point experienced some non-Native saying, "Oh, you don't look Indian." I mean, it just happens. I mean, and look, am I the dark? Nobody's going to carve my face, onto a nickel. I get that. I'm not trying to tout myself as as the poster boy for Indianness. But I mean, even I know people who I don't care what they look like. Oh, I didn't realize you don't look Indian. I mean, that's the Donald Trump line, right? They don't look Indian to me. We're talking about the Pequots because he couldn't compete against them in gaming. But anyway, we have been successful in educating the educators. And that's why school after school, year after year, they drop the names. And this year alone, there's at least, since January, I think there's at least a half a dozen schools that I'm aware of that dropped, some form of native nickname or mascot. And some years, it's even more. But so we've had success. Where we haven't had success is where the big moneyed interests are, like the NFL team in Washington, D.C. That's where we haven't had any success. And the reason is because until you cripple them, until you hit them in the wallet, a rich guy like Dan Snyder, the owner of the Washington football team, until you hit them in their wallet, they don't hear anything. They deflect. They'll ignore. I mean, and frankly, people who support the name, the use of native, they invariably will try to change the subject. You say, well, it's offensiveness. Well, I find Cowboys offensive and Vikings and, Fighting Irish. So they never can stay on target, on task, and look at the issue that we're talking about. They'll deflect. And that is exactly what a racist does all the time. The first time you call somebody out as a racist, they'll talk about reverse racism, which doesn't exist. They'll talk about what their experience and how they were mistreated, as some sort of marginalized person because they were Irish or Italian, and they were mistreated by black people or something like that. So they'll totally deflect, which is a way of addressing. I mean, there's two. Once somebody educates you and tries to enlighten you about what is offensive in some sort of racist behavior, there are two things that you can do. You can change your behavior and believe the person that's what they're telling you, or you can willfully remain ignorant and you can ignore what is being told to you, and you can deny somebody else's right to feel a certain way. I'm not telling people how to feel. All I can say is how somebody's actions affect me or impact me, or even if they don't, hurt me physically, how I know they've created something that I've got to somehow correct, either with my own children or my grandchildren or somebody else. I got to say that's wrong. That's wrong to do that. And so we've gone through this stuff, but again, until big money, and look, I'm glad they've done it. I'm glad FedEx and Nike and Walmart and all these companies, but you got to ask the question: what took so long? Why? Why couldn't you hear? Why couldn't you hear us? I mean, now we can put all the blame on Dan Snyder or the owners of the Cleveland baseball team or the Atlanta baseball team, but it took this long for shame? No, because it wasn't shame. What took this long was there to be a strong enough resurgence in anti-racism, in the fight against racism. It took another murder of an unarmed black man. It took racists running people over with their cars because they were either celebrating the takedown of a statue or they were protesting the existence of a Confederate slave era statue. And there's a certain irony that a protest associated with white supremacy, opposing white supremacy, gets plowed into by a white supremacist in a motor vehicle. And it just happened, again, just the other day. And it's happened several times. It's just like the idea of people protesting police brutality are met with police brutality. I mean, it's like you can't invent this stuff. I mean, to get the exact problem that you're protesting jammed in your face with batons and pepper spray and, look, the cops running people over. I mean, I saw the police cruiser in New York City that was opening their door as they were driving down the street, just trying to door people, knocking young kids, pepper spraying kids, knocking smaller women on the ground. And one woman had to go to the hospital with seizures because she was knocked to the ground. A 75-year-old man here in Buffalo getting knocked over by two police officers to the point where he had such a brain hemorrhage, blood starts pouring out of his ear. I mean, to go to a rally or a protest and protest police brutality and then be met with police brutality, that's exactly the point, right? So that's what is happening now. That is now capturing the attention of moneyed interest. I mean, look, Nike also took a chance in supporting Colin Kaepernick, which they were kind of slow to the dance, but they did it. And, so they stepped up and they took a bet that taking the right side of a social issue could be profitable. And they were right, it was. I mean, and again, I don't want to condemn them for it, but money talks. Because I guarantee if Nike got their asses kicked over supporting Colin Kaepernick and doing some sponsorship and hiring him, with some sponsorship, they wouldn't be very quick to this dance with Dan Snyder and the Washington football team. But, again, seeing more and more people come out to the street, and not just black people, not just native people, but white allies, people across all kinds of segments of society. And it'd be great to say people who cross all segments of the political spectrum, but unfortunately, you can look at almost any issue. If those who condemn Black Lives Matter are all on the right. Those who support racist mascots, native mascots, they're all on the right. It's almost an oxymoron to call them the right because they're so freaking wrong most of the time. I mean, that's the world that we live in, and it's not just Trump supporters, because look, there's a whole segment of politically right-leaning people who are coming to realize that Trump is the ass that most of us have always known him to be. And they're trying to create some distance. It's probably a little too late for them, but they still are going to watch Fox News religiously. They're still going to, condemn anything that they can characterize as liberal as, the enemy. And then, of course, try to weaponize this notion of political correctness, which is absurd. I mean, this whole idea of political correctness, these issues are about ethically correct, morally correct. It's about trying to be correct, from a social justice standpoint. But rather than address morality or ethics or justice, you put it into this other bucket and then call it a bad thing. Well, that's just political correctness run amok. Whatever the hell that's really supposed to mean. Look, you know what I think is where it's not even political correctness. I mean, when I think about absurd things, you know what's absurd is passing Americans with Disabilities Act, and then airlines putting Braille on a light switch on the overhead lights on a plane. Now, that is the idea of trying to be correct, going the wrong way, because obviously blind people don't need to turn lights on. That's kind of my point. But there's no question that the American with Disabilities Act was a giant step forward to try to make equal access to, for people who are wheelchair bound, for blind people, for deaf people, people who have a disability or who have a challenge of some sort. I don't even like to, call anybody who has, maybe some diminished, attribute disabled, because oftentimes you're going to find out that it's only disability because of what society has created, the fact that they've prohibited people from having access. The disability are the institutions. It's not the individual. And that's what we're talking about with any of this stuff. We're trying to say it's the institutions and the systems that have embedded racism or discrimination or prejudice into those systems. I mean, it isn't that Native people or Black people or somebody with a disability is a lesser human being, but the systems that have been constructed create that situation. That's what we're all trying to correct. That's what we're all working towards. And damn, it's a shame that we can't just appeal to somebody's sense of, morality. Instead, I mean, this is why people sue for millions of dollars. It's the only way you can ever send a signal to moneyed interests is to take their money. So, had FedEx and Nike and Pepsi and Target and Walmart not issued some financial crimping of Dan Snyder's pocketbook, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. There'd be those of us still wearing Caucasian shirts and trying to turn the tables a little bit so people understand, what it would be like if other people, if the majority, if white people, I wear an Aryan shirt with Donald Trump's picture on it because it's absurd, right? It's absurd to call a team by a name that's not even a racial slur, but it's a name that is associated with white supremacy. Oh, who would want to use that? But the point is to use, just like this Caucasian shirt to mock the Cleveland, baseball team. It's to call it out. And so we've been doing this. We've been doing it for over 30 years. Some people have been at this for a longer period of time than I have. And there's a whole range of people who have a variety of different ways of appealing to people. I like to talk about the juxtaposition of the treatment of kids in a residential school versus white kids playing Indian. But some people are much more effective than others. Some are more effective than I am. But there's been a lot of us out there talking about this stuff for 30 years. But see, we didn't have the financial strength to impact anybody. We weren't stopping people from going to games. We weren't stopping, sponsors and investors. Well, now they've stepped up. All right, hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break and come right back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Let me give a shout-out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises and the folks at Grand River Enterprises. And again, I want to give a shout-out to people who have supported the show in the past. We are entering our 11th year. And it is we couldn't have done it without a lot of support, and there's a few that were big supporters that are no longer with us. And, Sugar Montour comes to mind, and today I went to the socially distanced funeral and burial of Neville Spring, who has been one of my strongest supporters over the years, long before I was sitting behind a microphone, just when I was writing some blog posts and a few, columns and perhaps a letter to the editor or so. Neville used to actually print them out and put them out on his counter of his store on the Tonawanda territory. But folks like Neville and others who have supported this program, especially when I was doing this on commercial radio, and it was so very expensive. Neville and his family, so I want Nori and others, Nikki, Jesse, others who either through Neville's enterprises or their own enterprises were supporting what I've done or what I was doing. Greatly appreciated, and we we buried a very, very good man today. So I can't mention my current sponsors without giving another shout out to my good friend Neville Spring. All right, hey. Another thing that's happened is the Dakota Access Pipeline. The DAPL has been shut down, and again, these are victories, but and they're good things when some of these things happen. The idea that the Washington football team is probably going to change its name, the Cleveland baseball team is probably going to change its name, and even though sometimes these things happen for what I think are the wrong reasons, it's still a good thing that happened. So, for all of the protests, that stretched over essentially two presidencies, Obama and Trump, all the protests, 10,000 people accumulating at Standing Rock, and that didn't stop this. And the cry out from Native people about the quality of their life didn't stop this. This is essentially being stopped because a judge is finally acknowledging that the environmental reviews were not properly done. One of the things that they did and they do this all the time with pipelines in particular, they won't do an environmental review of the entire pipeline. They'll do an environmental review of a segment. So they can say, well, yeah, we're not going to impact the environment that much. We're, just from here to here. No, but that's not just what you're building. You're building not from here to here. You're building this. And so it's one of the ways they screw the system and cheat the system. And, of course, screw the environment. And ironically, we are still considered not just our territories, our sacrifice zones, but we are, as human beings, Native people, we're acceptable collateral damage. It seems like you have to have an endangered species, a fish or a bird or whatever else, which I think should be protected. But we're always going to be better off finding some other environmental concern other than our own health and safety and well-being, because, frankly, nobody gives a rat's ass about ours. And even this environmental review, and look, we hope this stands. I mean, I know they not only had to stop using the pipeline, but they actually had to drain it. There's no question that this thing is an environmental hazard waiting to happen. And while I'm glad to hear a judge stop this thing, at some point, we need to have the say on the stuff that impacts us. And we need to also be able to be a voice, as my good friend, Ed Schindler used to always say, somebody has to speak for creation. And it's not just about the environmental review. It's about anybody, the people who have the strongest connection to the earth. Now, I'm not saying that we should have veto power on everything that damages the earth, but we certainly should on what goes through our territory. And this was a big debate this year on the Canadian side. Should our ownership of land, should our rights on land grant us veto power for projects to go through? And Canada struggles with this, and the U.S. struggles with it. No, I take it back. They don't struggle with it. They say no. And I've talked about on the show just recently that the National Security Council, in addressing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples before it was passed in 2007, they wanted to be clear that everybody needed to know that the United States, when they talked about self-governance and self-determination, they didn't mean it the way the international community did. They meant internal self-determination. Like, they can make decisions about what they do. But the National Security Council issued a formal statement saying the United States does not acknowledge that Native people have the right to assert sovereignty over the land that they live on. Let me say it again. They wanted to be clear that in spite of the U.S. policy of promoting self-determination, that did not fit the international definition where self-determination included protecting your land. So that's the National Security Council of the United States. And this was during the Bush administration. But that policy's never changed, not through the Obama years, and it certainly hasn't changed through the Trump years. And again, it has its origins in the doctrine of Christian discovery that every European colony, including Canada, the United States, Australia, and other parts of Asia, Africa, this is how they asserted their right to create sacrifice zones and collateral damage that was acceptable. So, look, I applaud the shutting down of the Dakota Access Pipeline, even if I'm not crazy about what it took to finally do it. And look, when we're fighting these things, we have to pull every stop out. And, just like with the mascot issue, look, I'm glad that big moneyed interest finally, stepped up. It's just too bad that any of these issues can't be just judged on the right and wrongness, the rightness and the wrongness of them. But that's not the world that we live in, right? We live in a world that's driven by dollars and cents, driven by consumption. And the crazy part about it is this probably wouldn't have happened. I'll bet these judges were even affected by the fact that the demand isn't there because of not only this coronavirus, but the price of oil. If the demand was there, then the acceptable losses and the acceptable collateral damage, even whatever elements of the environment that seem to rate a lot higher than us, would have been, cast aside. So, but I did want to mention that and acknowledge that the pipeline at this point is halted and is being drained, I guess. We need to do more of it. We just need to do more of it. I don't know, on the coronavirus stuff, look, the U.S. Crossed over the 3 million mark for numbers of cases. The United States, I think, just about hit 1,000 dead for the day. The first time they've reached that number or close to that number in probably, almost a month. The numbers are almost insane. Today was the highest number of new cases on a Tuesday, and I say that because if you watch the pattern of the curve, if you will, the number of new cases doesn't change by a calendar day, day of the week, but how they're counted does. Every Sunday is the lowest, and then by the time you get to Thursday and Friday, they're the highest. Which by the time Thursday or Friday come along, it'll probably cross over the 60,000 new cases for the day mark, maybe higher than that, because this is a Tuesday and it was already at 55 or something like that. Third or fourth highest new case rate since this whole thing began. And again, for that to happen on a Tuesday when the numbers are usually down, they just don't accumulate the same way, during the course of the week. It's folks, I'm telling you, it's bad. And and granted, for the most part, some areas seem to have reduced numbers. New York State, the numbers have dropped, but it's just going to cycle back around. Look, there is 330 million people in the United States. 330 million people. Now, look, according to confirmed by tests, 3 million people have tested positive. Even if the number of people who are actually infected are 10 times that, there's still 300 million people that that haven't been infected yet. So, anybody who thinks, well, it's run its course. All the old people who were going to die have died. No, there's a ton more old people, and there's young people who are at risk. So, the sad part is there's pretty much consensus now in the medical community that simply mandating masks could do a lot But that's become, again, remember how I said there's the right and the left. Every wrong position is the right, the political right position. So, oh no, wearing a mask, that's liberal snowflakes. That's people buying into to the conspiracies that the government has created and that kind of stuff. But well, it is unfortunate. It's unfortunate that this thing is going to continue to literally plague humanity, and a lot of that plague is going to be directly associated with people who just don't give a crap, who don't care about other people. And look, so when I say that I know the numbers are going to get bad in New York State, here's the reason I know this. Because even though the numbers aren't bad right now, every place that I do go, that even with signs on the door say you must wear a mask, you go in there, you're going to see it's not just the customers, it's the staff work. If you wear a mask and you wear it below your nose, you're a moron. I mean, most people breathe through their nose. The only time people breathe through their mouth is when they're shouting, when they're out of breath, or if they've got a sinus condition. So if you're wearing your mask below your nose, then you're doing nothing. You're not protecting yourself, and you're not protecting anybody else. You're just being selfish, and you're doing the obligatory, and you're not even meeting the minimum obligation. Just by having a mask that's visible, you think you've done enough. And look, there's people on the subways, on the trains, and airplanes that aren't wearing masks. But look, when you go into any place of business and you realize that both the staff of that business and the consumers, if you're one of the few people properly wearing a mask, and well, even if you're among the majority of people who are properly wearing a mask, there are still enough people who aren't, that this thing is just gonna continue to go badly. And look, I've got family in California and in Texas, two states that are the hot zones right now. And it's New York isn't out of the woods. I mean, there's no building walls around New York State or New York City. It's just going to cycle back around, and and so when you talk about everything else that's going on, the tensions associated with race relations, the battle between the right and the left, and in an election year and in the political climate that exists, it's a very, very strange world that we're living in. But I'll say it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It's an incredible time to witness what's happening to humanity, what's happening to the United States. People, the Trumpers wearing their MAGA hats. We can debate whether the United States was ever great, but it is certainly in decline. And if you don't believe me, then look at how many people have fallen from the middle class. Look at how many people have to have dual incomes to have a basic standard of acceptable standard of living. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, one parent had to work 4 hours a week to support a family of 5. Now, two parents have to work, 40, 50, 60 hours a week to support a family of 3. And of course, why is that? Well, it's because we're consumer junkies. We've got to have, with 2 drivers, we have to have 3 vehicles. We've got to buy every new gadget that's disposable. As soon as the state of the art Target moves a little bit. So, I mean, this is the world that we're living in until it crashes. And I've talked about the fact that I think the economic impact has not been felt yet. And look, you can hear all the people on the radio and talking about things like the Wall Street and how the Dow Jones is going, but what people are not recognizing enough is that all the states, none of their revenue is where it used to be. Some states have lost 50, 60, 70% of the revenue. I mean, and that includes things like sales tax. If they get revenue from hydrofracking or oil, extractive industries or whatever else, that's all gone. And some of that's coronavirus related, but some of it's related to the fact that Russia and the Saudis got into a pissing match over oil prices. So things that are beyond the influence of the United States, not beyond the impact, but beyond the influence. So all this stuff is going to come to a head. We're not even close to feeling this. I mean, you haven't seen a state have to figure out how they're going to slash the education budget. People are pissing and moaning about whether school's going to be in session in fall. I don't know how they're going to afford school. How the states and how the counties, how the townships are going to afford to put kids back in school. I don't know. We're going to see how that all plays out. Anyway, that's my little digression to COVID-19 and where that's all going. But I do, like I said, I have to, applaud people who are in the movement. So whether you're talking about, especially the women who stepped up with Dakota Access Pipeline, look, I know there's a lot of men that were involved, and I'm not trying to diminish the impacts, but the women who stepped up are deserve attention. This mascot issue, some of the most active people that I know have been women. Amanda Blackhorse, Jackie Keeler, Donna Fan Boyle. These are people that I've gotten to know over the years, and their work has been incredible and relentless. They just, in spite of the threats, the accusations, that even sometimes threats of physical harm or even death. I mean, and look, I've gotten them too. Trust me, I pissed off a lot of people in Lancaster when was speaking, not only there at the school but in the media and that kind of stuff. So, but the courage that it takes, some of our most vulnerable being, and I look, I'm not trying to be patronizing or anything, but when I think about what Native women go through, the whole missing and murdered Indigenous women, and yet there's still women who place themselves on the front line of these battles, knowing that, look, they have a much greater chance of being harmed, sexually assaulted, murdered, kidnapped, and yet we've got some incredible Native women who have stepped up. Some of the locals here too. I mean, I don't want to take anything away from anybody. And I mentioned a few individuals, but there have been Native women who step up, are on the front lines of all this stuff. So I want to give my shout out to them, and of course, my friends in particular, Donna Fan Boyle. I hope you. I put the T-shirt in the mail. I got yours, so I sent you mine. But the work that people do is incredible, and look, it's not easy to stay committed to this stuff, especially because even when you do achieve a certain level of success on a battle, you've got to weigh it all out and say, geez, was my fight what did it? And yes, it was. I mean, in this situation, I know, I've said, look, money talks. All the other stuff seemed to fall on deaf ears. But, it did fall on the deaf ears of the people who make the ultimate decision. But had we not been raising these issues every step along the way, raising the issues about racism and the psychological damage this has not only on Native children, but on non-Native children too, this idea of promoting stereotypes and racism, how it has negative impacts. Look, we've been at this, and we go over it over and over and over again. And eventually, these are the things that do hit somebody in the pocketbook. I mean, like I said, it's unfortunate that we can't address these issues on simple moral grounds, on the rightness and the wrongness of something. But that's the fight that we're going to have. That's the fight that we're going to continue to be champions for. And until that fight translates into economic impact, it's a long fight. It's a long fight, and But the quality of life and again, economic impact. Everything is hinging on dollars and cents so much in the global economy, as they call it, that you can't deny it and you can't ignore it. So there is money to be made in immorality, obviously, slavery, sex industries, corruption. There's money to be made, but everything that is done that challenges morality and ethics has another cost. It isn't just the cost of a product. It's the cost of quality of life. Somebody has to bear the brunt of the negative impact. Any crime that is committed, any immoral and unethical thing that is done impacts environment. It impacts our children. It impacts the next generation or several generations. So there is a cost to this stuff. It isn't just victimless crime. There's no such thing as victimless crime. I take it back. What I'm talking about, there's no such thing as victimless crime. I think there are some things that people can do that have been criminalized. Smoking marijuana, for instance, and that kind of stuff. But when I think about what the power elite get away with, and the negative impacts that they have on so much of our society. I mean, just economic disparity. The fact that you've got, the 1% with over 50% of the wealth or 60% of the wealth of any given country, that has a huge negative impact on those of us who struggle to take care of our families and to do right by the people we care about. And look, I know that there's wealth in every segment of society, I guess, scattered through. I mean, there are wealthy black men, there are wealthy Native people, a lot of wealthy white people, and there are poor white people. And the vast majority of Native people and black people are struggling. And the vast majority are right at the poverty level. So there's a negative impact with all of this stuff. For everybody who has financial success, there are dozens who are paying for that financial success and enjoying none of that success. This is the challenge. We can't pretend that this is victimless. Injustice has a cost. It has unfortunately, until it has a financial cost to those who are perpetrating that injustice, it's hard to get much movement. But there is financial cost. There is quality of life that is diminished because of injustice. And that's why it's on us to push back and to fight it every step along the way. So whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's, death by cop, whether it's missing and murdered Indigenous women, whether it's poverty, whether it's suicide, depression. These are the things that we all have an obligation to address in our lives, and not just the ones that we love, but we need to address it with everyone. And it's not enough to say you're not a racist. If you're not an anti-racist, if you're not actively stepping up when somebody tells some obscene racist joke and say, look, I don't want to hear that. Or somebody uses some racial epithet and you don't step up and say, that's inappropriate. It doesn't hurt you to say it. It's a little uncomfortable. But that's the least we could do. Look, I want to thank you guys for listening. We are on this Thursday on WBAI, so we will be doing a show which will go out just like this on a Facebook live stream and, of course, onto our YouTube video. So, or if you're in New York City, you can tune us in on WBAI. We will be on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 99.5 on your FM dial in New York City, and streaming on their website, which is WBAI.org. So we'll be back on Thursday, and we'll see you then. Thanks for listening. Yahweh.